Desperate and alone outside during my stepfather's funeral, I was driven away by my own stepbrother, who was certain the house was his alone, until the will was read. Jake never expected to find himself preparing for the burial of his stepfather, Richard, a man who had shaped his life with constant criticism and an unyielding, cold demeanor. From the moment his mother, Sarah, married Richard when Jake was only 9, his world had been defined by harsh words and unmet expectations. Despite his best efforts to gain approval, Jake always felt like a stranger in his own home, overshadowed by his stepbrother Michael, Richard's biological son, who seemed to receive nothing but praise. Now, as he sits alone, organizing old photographs and memories, Jake can't help but wonder, did Richard ever care about him at all? Was the tough love Richard claimed to offer truly meant to prepare him for life? Or was it just a mask for something deeper, something cruel? With Richard's death, Jake was forced to confront his past, but little did he know, the secrets that would be uncovered would shatter everything he thought he understood about family, love, and legacy. As Jake looks back on his tumultuous childhood, memories of Richard's harshness flood his mind like a relentless wave. Richard was a man of few words, and those he spoke were often laced with criticism. From the very beginning, Jake felt like an outsider in his own home. While his stepfather's stern demeanor might have been seen as tough love by his mother, Sarah, Jake never understood why it had to be so unrelenting. Every day felt like a test he could never pass. No matter how hard he tried, whether it was in school or at the dinner table, Richard's eyes seemed to find fault with every little thing he did. "You need to work harder, or this cruel world will chew you up and spit you out," Richard would say, his voice cold and emotionless. For years, Jake fought to earn Richard's approval, but it always felt like an impossible battle. The arrival of Michael, Richard's biological son, only deepened Jake's sense of inadequacy. Michael was everything Jake wasn't: carefree, loved, and adored by Richard. It was as if Jake had never existed in his stepfather's eyes. Michael was the golden child, receiving constant praise and attention, while Jake was left to wrestle with rejection. The pain of knowing Richard's love was reserved for someone else was unbearable, yet Jake tried to bury it. He wanted to be the son Richard would be proud of, but all he ever received were harsh words and a constant reminder of his failure. Despite all of this, Jake couldn't escape the nagging hope that one day, just one day, Richard would look at him differently. That hope was crushed when Michael was born. Richard's affection was no longer even hidden. Michael was his true son, and Jake was just a shadow in the family. The years that followed were a constant battle with his own self-worth, a fight that Jake could never seem to win. As Jake grew older, the tension in the household thickened, the emotional distance between him and Richard widening with each passing day. But it wasn't just the harsh words and constant criticism that wore Jake down, it was the suffocating silence that followed. Richard's disapproval was always loud, always present, but it was the absence of any affection that left the deepest scar. The more Jake tried to prove himself, the more he felt invisible. He would throw himself into his schoolwork, hoping to hear the words, "I'm proud of you," just once, but they never came. Instead, Richard's eyes only seemed to see flaws. At every family gathering, Jake knew the rule to sit up straight, use the proper fork, don't speak unless spoken to. One mistake, one misstep, and Richard's piercing stare would be enough to make Jake feel smaller than ever. The weight of Richard's coldness grew heavier over time, and Jake began to question his own worth. Was he truly a failure? Or was he just a victim of a man who could never show love, only demand perfection? Richard's relentless pursuit of discipline, though it may have been intended to prepare Jake for a harsh world, felt like a constant reminder that Jake would never be good enough. Family vacations, which should have been moments of joy, turned into military drills. Every misstep, every delayed plan would send Richard into a furious spiral, his anger settling over the family like a dark cloud. Yet, amid all this chaos, a small part of Jake still clung to the hope that one day Richard would soften, would acknowledge the son who who desperately wanted to be seen. That hope was shattered when Richard poured all his love into Michael, his true son, leaving Jake to grapple with feelings of abandonment. He had tried for years, but now he knew he would never be the son Richard wanted. When Sarah, Jake's mother, fell seriously ill at 25, the fragile balance within their broken family was put to the ultimate test. Her decline was a slow, painful process that seemed to strip away the last bit of warmth in the house. The moments of tenderness Jake had hoped for, the moments when Richard might show some semblance of compassion, were few and far between. During Sarah's illness, Richard's coldness didn't soften. Instead, it became more apparent. Yet Jake, in the midst of his own heartache, found himself stepping into a caregiver role, taking on the responsibilities of looking after a mother who was too weak to care for herself, and a stepfather whose body was now failing him. The irony was not lost on Jake. He had spent his whole life trying to earn Richard's approval. And now, at the most critical time, it was him, not Richard, who had to step up. Late nights were spent sitting by his mother's bed, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep, while Richard remained distant and aloof, his eyes always focused on some far-off place. It was almost as if Richard's inability to connect emotionally had become a shield, one that he hid behind even as his wife was dying. Jake began to question why he even bothered. What had he been hoping for all these years? Richard's love, affection, validation? It seemed futile now. Yet, amid the harshness of those days, Jake caught fleeting glimpses of something else in Richard's eyes, something that hinted at regret, or perhaps recognition. There were moments when Richard's stiff hand would gently adjust Sarah's pillow, or when he would silently sit beside her, his face softening for just a brief moment. In those rare moments, Jake saw the humanity in Richard, but it never lasted long enough to make a difference. His mother passed away, and with her death, it felt like the last tether holding their fractured family together had snapped. The funeral was a quiet affair, defined by a strange, oppressive silence. Richard remained stoic, a monument of coldness, while Jake stood there, unsure of where he stood in the wreckage of their broken family. The distance between them was now a canyon. Despite everything he had done for Richard, despite all the years of waiting for a father's approval, it felt like nothing had truly mattered. The wall between them had never come down. Jake had always felt like an outsider in his own home, but it wasn't until Richard's death that the full weight of his role in the family finally hit him. After the funeral, as the last of the mourners filtered out and the quiet settled in, a new kind of emptiness crept over Jake. His mother was gone, and with her, any semblance of unity had dissolved. Richard's passing, rather than bringing any sort of closure or peace, only served to amplify the fractures in the family. Jake had spent years looking after a man who had never shown him love, only criticism. And now, after all the sacrifices, the question lingered, what had it all been for? As Jake walked through the house, sorting through the boxes of memories, it became increasingly clear how much he had invested in trying to build something with Richard that was never there. Every photograph, every old letter felt like a reminder of the time he had wasted, of the years he spent fighting for approval that was never going to come. But that night, as the finality of Richard's death began to settle in, Michael arrived with a smug expression on his face. He strolled in, practically oozing entitlement, as if this whole situation had been inevitable. When Michael casually mentioned that Jake would have to leave the house because it was his, the words felt like a slap in the face. Jake stood there, numb with disbelief. For a moment, the years of resentment, the emotional scars from being ignored and criticized, all rushed to the surface. The house, his childhood home, the place where he had fought so hard to feel seen, was now being claimed by Michael, the favored son. The anger inside Jake rose like a tide, but he quickly pushed it down. What could he do? The family had always been divided, and no matter what he had done for Richard, no matter how much he had given, it meant nothing now. In that moment, Jake realized just how much he had been fooling himself. The bonds he had hoped for with Richard were a mirage, and he was still left with nothing. With a quiet voice, Jake agreed, knowing deep down that the fight wasn't worth it anymore. "Fine, I'll be out by the end of the month." The words felt hollow, like a surrender. And so, Jake began packing, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was truly alone. Jake spent the next few days in a haze, his mind a whirlwind of emotions as he began the painstaking process of packing up his life. Each box felt like another piece of his past being sealed away, memories trapped in cardboard, unable to offer any comfort. The house that once echoed with laughter and the scent of his mother's cooking now felt foreign, cold, and hollow. As he sifted through years of old belongings, Jake couldn't help but replay the moments that had led him here. Richard's criticism, his unyielding coldness, the small moments of tenderness that never lasted long enough to matter. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a physical force, suffocating him. He couldn't shake the feeling of being robbed not just of a home, but of his dignity. He had given so much of himself, cared for Richard when no one else could or would, and yet it seemed to have meant nothing in the end. Michael had always been Richard's favorite, but Jake had hoped that, in the end, he would at least have earned some acknowledgement of the years spent trying to bridge the gap between them. But instead, all he was left with was the bitter taste of betrayal, watching as Michael waltzed into the house like it had always been his, like Jake had never been a part of this family at all. The anger bubbled up in Jake, threatening to break free, but he kept it buried deep inside. It wasn't just Michael's arrogance that stunned it, was the realization that Richard's indifference had never really been about Jake at all. Richard had never seen him as his son, just a person to be molded, controlled, and constantly criticized. All of Jake's efforts to meet his stepfather's impossible standards had been for nothing. And now, in the aftermath of Richard's death, it was clear that nothing had changed. Michael was still the golden child, and Jake was nothing more than an outsider, the person who had been discarded when he was no longer needed. Late that night, after the house had settled into a suffocating silence, Jake found himself standing in front of his mother's old bedroom, his hand resting on the doorknob. For a brief moment, he considered staying. He could defy Michael, fight for what he thought was rightfully his. But then, as the weight of the past pressed down on him, he knew it wouldn't change anything. Richard was gone. The family he had always dreamed of never existed. With a deep breath, Jake turned away and began packing once more, feeling the last of his hope slipping through his fingers. The fight wasn't worth it anymore. There was nothing left to fight for. As Jake finished packing the last of his belongings, the house felt even emptier than it had before. Each corner seemed to echo with memories of a family that was never truly his. He had spent so many years trying to prove himself to Richard, and in the end, all it had earned him was a cold house and a cold legacy. The cruelest blow came when Michael, with his arrogant smirk, took ownership of the house with ease, leaving Jake to grapple with the finality of it all. The inheritance was a cruel joke, and Jake realized that he had never been part of Richard's true family. He was an afterthought, someone who could be easily cast aside once Richard was gone. That night, as Jake sat alone in his childhood home, surrounded by the boxes he had packed, his mind raced. He couldn't shake the crushing sense of abandonment, the feeling that his entire life had been spent chasing something that was never within reach. He had always believed that, one day, Richard would acknowledge his efforts, even if it was just a fleeting moment of pride. But now, all of those years of sacrifice felt like wasted time. He wasn't even allowed to keep the house his mother's house, the place where he had hoped to build memories and find peace. Instead, Michael, who had been Richard's golden child from the start, had won again. Jake couldn't help but feel a mixture of anger and sadness. He had given everything to Richard. He had been there when no one else was. He had cared for a man who had never cared for him. And now, as Michael strutted off with everything Jake had ever worked for, a bitter realization washed over him. He had been a fool. All this time, he had believed that love could be earned. But in this family, love was never given, only taken. As Jake stood up, his heart heavy, he felt the sting of defeat deep in his chest. He wasn't sure where to go next, but one thing was clear: He couldn't stay here any longer. The house, the family, the memories, they were all a part of a past that he needed to leave behind. As he closed the door behind him for the last time, he knew that this chapter of his life had come to an end. The question now was, what would he do with the future? The next few days were a blur of emotions as Jake tried to adjust to the reality that Michael now controlled the house, and with it, the last remaining thread of the family that had once been so important to him. Jake wandered through his empty childhood home, the air thick with the echoes of his past, each room a painful reminder of what he had lost. He kept replaying the last conversation with Michael, the way his stepbrother had so easily dismissed him, as if Jake had never mattered. "This is mine now, Jake. You never stood a chance." Michael's words had stung, sharp and final, sealing the deal on Jake's emotional exile from the family. It felt like the final betrayal alone that was even worse than Richard's coldness. But even worse than Michael's arrogance was the gnawing question Jake couldn't shake. Why hadn't Richard ever cared for him? After all the sacrifices, all the years of trying to be the son Richard wanted, the cruel truth was that nothing had ever been enough. And now, after Richard's death, Jake was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by years of neglect. At night, Jake lay awake in a strange, quiet Beatty's. Mother's sister, Linda, had offered him a place to stay, but the loneliness weighed on him like a 1,000-pound stone. The house where he had grown up, the one he had worked so hard to make his own, was now a distant memory. The thought of Michael's smug face, strutting around with everything Jake had tried to hold on to, filled him with a rage that kept him awake for hours. How had it come to this? His mind raced with possibilities. Could he have fought harder for what he believed was his? But deep down, Jake knew that the fight wasn't worth it. He had been fighting for a family that never truly existed, and now, as the days passed, it seemed like everything had slipped away, leaving only the remnants of his hope. Jake's heart was heavy with resentment as he packed up the last of his belongings. The weight of betrayal hung over him like a dark cloud. The house, once filled with his mother's laughter and warmth, now felt like an alien space, a place where he no longer belonged. The walls, which had once held memories of childhood moments, were now silent, suffocating. It wasn't just the house that Jake had lost. It was the family he had spent his entire life trying to fit into, trying to prove his worth. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Michael, with his entitled smirk, had taken everything his childhood home, his connection to his stepfather, and the sense of belonging that Jake had so desperately sought for years. Michael's arrogance was the final nail in the coffin, and Jake felt himself slowly suffocating in the grief of it all. But there was more to the story now. The moment Michael had demanded Jake leave, Jake had been too stunned to fight back. But the following days, as he sorted through the memories of his life, the anger had begun to build. It wasn't just the house that had been taken from him, it was everything. The love he had never received, the approval he had longed for, Richard's failure to acknowledge his son, to appreciate all the years of sacrifice, burned inside him like an unhealed wound. The fact that Michael could waltz in, without any of the emotional scars Jake carried, and claim the house as his own, was an insult Jake couldn't ignore. That evening, as Jake sat in the quiet of the empty house, he replayed Michael's words over and over again. "This house is mine now." The bitterness burned through him, and suddenly, Jake's mind filled with a thought that terrified him. What if Richard had never intended for Jake to inherit anything? It had always been Michael's place. Richard had always known. The realization was a gut punch. There would be no reconciliation, no forgiveness from a father who had never cared enough to show it. Michael had been his true son from the start, and Jake was left to pick up the broken pieces of a family he had tried so hard to keep together. The truth stung, and Jake had no choice but to face it. The morning after the confrontation with Michael, Jake's mind was still reeling. He had expected anger, expected resistance, but he hadn't prepared for the hollow emptiness that followed. His childhood home was no longer his. It never truly had been. He had fought for it, hoped for it, but in the end, it had slipped through his fingers like sand. The house, once a symbol of his struggle for acceptance, now seemed like a cruel joke. As he walked through each room one last time, he could feel the weight of the past pressing in on him. Each object he packed, each photograph he held, felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into the realization that he had been chasing a mirage all along. The anger he had felt towards Michael was now mingled with something darker: betrayal. Michael, the golden child, had always been Richard's true son. Jake had been nothing more than an afterthought, someone who could be pushed aside when it suited the family. The painful truth began to sink in. Richard had never intended for Jake to inherit anything. The will, the house sit had all been a formality, a final insult that Jake was too blinded by hope to see. Richard had chosen Michael long ago, and Jake had been too naive to realize it. The sting of the truth was sharp, but it was also liberating in a way. For the first time, Jake realized that the family he had been desperately trying to hold on to was gone, and it was time for him to let go. But that didn't make it any easier. The years of sacrifice, the emotional scars, none of it seemed to matter now. As Jake packed the last of his things, a strange numbness settled over him. He wasn't just leaving the house, he was leaving behind the dream of a family that had never truly existed. The realization cut deeper than anything Richard or Michael could ever have done to him. The weeks that followed Richard's death felt like a blur of numbness, but everything changed when the lawyer, Mr. Thompson, called. His voice was grave, serious, and it sent a shiver down Jake's spine. "There's something important about Richard's will that you need to see." Jake's heart raced. Could there be more to this than just Michael's inheritance? Had Richard left him anything at all to prove that he mattered? The hope, that flickering light he had buried deep inside for years, sparked again. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to make sense of everything that had been stolen from him. When Jake arrived at the lawyer's office the next day, he was not prepared for the shock that awaited him. Michael was already there, sitting with his arms crossed, his face tight with an unreadable expression. Jake couldn't help but feel a flicker of anger at the sight of him. Michael had always been the favored one, and here he was, already acting like everything belonged to him. He barely acknowledged Jake's presence, his eyes flashing with the same smug entitlement that had marked his every interaction since Richard's death. Mr. Thompson, however, remained calm and professional as he presented the will. "Jake," he said, clearing his throat. "According to Richard's will, everything, the house, the savings, all of his personal possessions has been left to you." Jake blinked, unable to process the words at first. He had heard wrong. Richard had left him everything? His mind spun as the room fell deathly silent. He turned to Michael, whose face had drained of color. For the first time, Michael looked genuinely shocked, his disbelief written all over his face. But the shock was not over yet. Mr. Thompson continued, reading a letter Richard had written to Jake, a letter that made everything painfully clear. Richard had recognized his failings as a father, and in his final moments, he had given Jake the inheritance, not out of obligation, but as a tribute to the son who had never given up on him. The weight of the words crashed down on Jake like a wave, and for the first time, he understood. Richard had seen him, not as a failure, but as the man he had always hoped Jake would become. The years of pain, the endless criticism, had somehow led to this bittersweet victory. Yet, as he glanced at Michael, the anger in Jake's chest flared again. Michael, who had always been the golden child, had been stripped of everything he thought he was entitled to, and Jake, for once, had something that was truly his. As Jake sat in the lawyer's office, the weight of Richard's final words hung heavily in the air. The revelation that he had inherited everything, was both a shock and a bittersweet victory. Richard's letter, filled with regret and acknowledgement, pierced through Jake's heart. For years, he had been searching for validation, and now, in the most unexpected way, it had come. Richard had seen him, not as the failure he always feared he was, but as the man who had truly embodied the values Richard had failed to teach him. It was almost too much to absorb. The years of harshness, the years of longing for love, now suddenly felt like they had a purpose. But as the shock of the inheritance set in, Jake's mind shifted to Michael. His stepbrother's reaction shock, fury, disbelief was almost satisfying. For the first time, Michael was on the receiving end of the cold indifference he had always shown Jake. The roles had reversed, and Jake couldn't help but savor the irony. Michael had always been Richard's chosen son, but in the end, it was Jake who stood tall, carrying the legacy of a man who had never truly loved him. The victory felt hollow, but in that moment, Jake knew it was time to move forward away from the family that had never truly been his.